What's up, guys? Justin here with TheSketchUpEssentials.com, back with another SketchUp Essentials tutorial for you. So today, this is part 2 of our getting started tutorial for woodworkers. So this is basically targeted at woodworkers, but also it's going to have some good information for everybody in there. So let's go ahead and just jump into it. All right, so in part 1, we talked about kind of the basics of getting started. I'll link to that up above and also in the notes below. In this video, we're going to talk a little bit more about some other kinds of shapes we can draw, making copies of objects, and the importance of groups and components, along with some other stuff. So if you remember in the first video, so this is our default model, if you remember, and every new SketchUp model starts with a default model. You can go ahead and delete that out for right now. So if you remember in the first video, we had talked about how you could create shapes by creating faces and then extruding them to 3D. So if I was to use the rectangle tool by tapping the R key and drawing a shape, then I could use the push-pull tool, which I can activate by using the P key and then clicking on this in order to extrude it into 3D. So we had talked about how to create some shapes by doing that. And one thing I wanted to talk about just real quick is not only can you do that with right angles and square objects like this, you can also do it using the arc tool and the circle tool. So you can activate the circle tool by tapping the C key on your keyboard, and then you just click once to set your center point, and you can click again to set your edge. So you're basically setting this based on your radius, and then you can push-pull that into 3D. So you can see how now I've got a 3D tube shape. And there's one thing I want to note on this, which is if I activate the push-pull tool, you can see how I can't push-pull on this surface. So SketchUp as a base installation doesn't allow you to push-pull curved surfaces. So you can see how I could push-pull this surface because it's flat, but this surface is curved, so you can't push-pull those surfaces. Now there is an extension called joint push-pull that you can use in order to do that, but generally that's kind of a limitation of SketchUp, is you're not going to be able to push-pull curved surfaces without an extension. So the other thing I want to note about creating curves is you can use the circle tool to create curves, or also the arc tool, which you can activate by tapping the A key. But you can see how when I activate one of those tools, like if I activate the circle tool by tapping the C key, if you look down here in the corner, it tells you the number of sides in your circle. And so what you can do is before you draw your circle, you can set the number of sides by typing a number and hitting the enter key. So like right now, I can type in 8 and create an 8-sided circle, and you can see how, so that's an octagon. And then if I activate the circle tool again, and I type in 24 and hit the enter key, then that creates a 24-sided circle. So every curve in SketchUp is made up of segments, meaning that even this circle isn't a true curve. You can see how it's just got little segments in here. And so you can set the tools to have a certain number of segments in it to make that curve smoother. So you can see how I created a 48-sided circle here. Well, that's got more segments and it looks smoother. But if you zoom out, you can't really tell the difference. And the reason this matters is because the more segments you use in your curves, the more faces SketchUp is going to create as you extrude them and that sort of thing. So for example, if I push-pull this kind of octagon shape and then I triple-click on it, that selects everything in this object. You can see how my entity info shows 34 entities. That means it's got 34 lines, faces, all of that different kind of stuff. So now if I push-pull this object to the same length and I triple-click on it, you can see how that has 98 entities. And that was a 24-sided circle. And then if I push-pull this one and triple-click on that, that has 194 entities. So basically, the smoother your curves are, or the more segments there are in your curves, the smoother everything's going to look, but you're also going to create more stuff that SketchUp has to render, and so it can really slow down your model. And you can see how if you look between the two of these objects right here, they don't really look that different. So it's usually better to try to minimize the number of segments as much as you can without making everything look kind of blocky. So that's just something that as your models get bigger, you can use in order to make everything run faster. So The next thing I want to talk about is merging faces and also kind of keeping our model organized. So for example, if I create a rectangle and I pull it up like this, this has 4 faces around this edge. Well, now if I come in here and I create another rectangle right here, you can see how it shares. So these faces share these coplanar lines. So this line makes up part of the border of this face and also part of the border of this face. And so that means if I come in here and I try to move this, you can see how that's stretching out my other object because the faces have merged. So if you come in here and you model a whole bunch of different things and they all kind of share faces, then you're not going to be able to make any changes later. So if I come in here and I create an object kind of like this one, and I make a copy over here, and I'll talk about how I did that in a second. But let's say I make a copy over here. Well, now I can't really move this object around without affecting the faces on this object. And so the way that we're going to get around that is we're going to model using groups. And so to model using groups, all you're going to do is you're going to create an object like this one. You're just going to select it, you're going to right click on it, and you're going to click Make Group. And so now you can see what that did is now SketchUp makes the lines around this blue, and if I click on a face, you see how it's not letting me select the individual faces? That's because all of this geometry is now contained in a group. And so now to edit that, what I have to do is just double click on this object, and now I can get in there and I can edit all the parts and pieces. So now that this is grouped, if I was to come in here and draw another rectangle and pull it up, these faces aren't going to merge anymore because this is all grouped together. So now if I move this object out, you can see how I can separate the two just by moving them out. So usually you're going to want to try to organize your models as you go by putting everything in groups. And one of the ways that makes this easier is there's a section in your tray called the outliner. And the outliner is basically going to contain all the information for your groups and your components in your model. And so the way that you're going to get to the outliner is, first of all, you're going to want to make sure it's turned on. So you're going to want to go up to Window, Default Tray, make sure that you've checked Show Tray, and you're going to want to make sure the box for outliner is checked. And then you're going to go down this list and you're going to look for outliner, and you're going to click the little arrow next to it to open it up. And so now if you look in the outliner, you can see how I have a single group in here. And if I click on that, you can see how that selects that object in your model. So this group is this group that we created right here. And so not only can I double click on the group over here to edit it, I can also double click in the outliner to edit it. So this makes it real easy to find your stuff and keep everything really organized. And what you can do is over here in the outliner, you can right click on objects in here and you can rename them. So in this case, what I could do is I could call this large box. And then if I was to group this one, so I select it, right click and click Make Group, you can see how a second group shows up, and I can come in here and call this small box. So now it's real easy to select your large box or your small box. And one of the cool things that you can do with this is you can also group, you can put groups into a group. And so like for example, let's say that I had a pair of cylinders. So what I would do is I would select this one, I would make it a group, and I would call it small cylinder. I would select this one, I'd also make it a group, and I'd call it large cylinder. And then what I can do is I can select both objects by holding the control key. So I can click on one, I can hold the control key, and I can click on the other to select them both. Then I can right click in here and I can say Make Group. And so now you can see how this has drawn a box around both objects, and it's also showing up as a group with these two groups inside of it. And so now what I can do is I can call this cylinders. And I can do the same thing over here. I can group this one. and I can call this one boxes. And then I can minimize these, so I can select my boxes group or my cylinders group just by clicking on it. So, and you can also move things around. So like I could drag the large cylinder into the boxes group. So you can use the outliner to keep everything organized in your model. So the outliner is a great way to keep everything organized. The other thing that this is great for is managing your visible objects. So if I come in here to the outliner and I right click on the large cylinder, I can click hide so that that object doesn't show up in my model anymore. But the problem is, whoops, that's in a group, and so when I click unhide, it doesn't necessarily unhide. You have to be inside the group in order for unhide to work. So, but you can right click on objects in your outliner, and you can right click and you can say hide, or you can unhide different objects by using the outliner. So it's a great way to keep your model organized. So the next thing I want to talk about is components. So these are groups, and groups are basically objects in your model that's just a group of geometry. So my cylinder is a group, and if I make a copy of that object, so if I make a copy of this cylinder, for example, inside this group, you can see how now I have two of these objects, and they're just kind of individual. So I can come in here and I can edit one and leave the other one. So with groups, there's no real link between your groups. They're just kind of dumb geometry. But with components, what you can do is if I come in here and I create a component, so we'll just call this a box, we'll just push-pull it, and we'll just right-click, and instead of selecting group, we're going to call it component. So you want to select this make component option. And that's going to pop up this little box where you can name your component. And there's a few other options in here we're not really going to talk about right now. Really, the only thing we care about right now is we're going to call this object box component, and we're going to make sure this box is checked. So you want to make sure replace selection with component is checked. So now if I create that, you can see how this shows up differently in my outliner. It's got these little angles around the outside of them. That indicates that this is a component, not just a group. And it's also got the the icon for it looks a little bit different. Well, now if I make a copy of this box, you can see how these are named the same thing, but since these are components, if I change one, then the other one's going to change with it. So that's the difference between groups and components, is components are kind of linked. So these are copies of the same object. So whatever I change with one, every single copy of my box component is going to change as well. So it doesn't matter how many of them there are in your model. Like if I take these and I make a whole bunch of different copies, then still each one of them I edit, since they're all copies of the same component, are going to change with it. So components are all linked. You're going to use components anytime you have an object that you might make a copy of. So for like table legs or shelves or anything like that where you may need to edit multiple ones at once in the future, you're going to want to make sure those are components. So the only time you'd use a group instead is if it's something that you're never going to make a copy of ever. So and I can do the same thing where I can group all of these, and then I can name this box components and then minimize it. So now I can select that group really easily. I can kind of move it out of the way, and I can hide it. So you can see how easy it is to come in here and just manage my different hidden objects and my different groups and that sort of thing. So the outliner is something I really recommend you start off using, because an organized model is an easy model to use. Now that we've talked about that, I want to talk a little bit about using the move tool. So the move tool allows you to move different objects around in your model. So like for example, and sorry I keep going back to these boxes, but they're really easy to use. So if I come in here and I make a box that's a group, I can use the move tool by tapping the M key to move it around. So I can either tap the M key or I can click on this little icon, and then you can see how it tells me down at the bottom, pick 2 points to move. Well, basically what it's telling me is I need to set a base point. So in this case it's going to be this corner, and then it wants me to set the move point. So it's asking me, okay, what point do you want me to start the move from? And then what point do you want to end the move at? So where do you want to move the object? So, and one of the things a lot of people don't realize about the move tool is your base point doesn't have to be on your object. Like for example, I could pick a point all the way out here as my base point, and I can move my mouse over, and it's going to allow me to move my object without ever actually clicking on it. So your base point can be wherever. So, and not only that, if you look down here in the corner, it's also got a distance option. So in this case, if I want to take this corner and I want to move this 10 feet in a direction, all I have to do is set my base point, move my mouse in the direction that I want to move this, and then type in a distance. So in this case, I'm going to type in 10 feet and hit the enter key. And so if I come back in here with the tape measure tool, you're going to have a distance of 10 feet between this point and this point. So you can move objects very precisely when doing this. So that's how you'd move an object, and you can also move multiple objects at one time. So I could select both of these objects, I could activate the move tool and set this corner point, and I can move both of them because I have both of them selected. So you can move as many objects as you want, and not only can you move things, not only can you move groups and objects, you can also move like the individual parts and pieces. So I can select a face and I can move the face around, or I could select this line and I can move this line around. And you have to remember, when you select this line and you move it, you're changing the border of these faces, and so your object shape changes. So you can use this to do some pretty interesting things. And then the other thing a lot of people don't realize about the move tool, and this is probably the most powerful thing about the move tool, is not only can you use it to move objects around, you can also use it to make copies. So like for example, if I do the same thing I did before, I select this object, I activate the move tool, and then I set this corner point. If you look down at the bottom of the page, you can see where it says control equals toggle copy. So what that means is if you tap the control key while the move tool is active, it's going to turn on copy mode. So instead of moving the object that you have selected, if you tap the control key, it's going to make a copy of the object you have selected in the direction that you move your mouse. And you can do the same thing here, where I could type in 10 feet and hit the enter key, and I can make a copy of that object 10 feet from this corner to this corner. So again, you can do this with multiple objects as well. So I could make another copy 10 feet in this direction, and I could just keep going. I mean, you can make copies of basically whatever you have selected. And then same kind of thing as before, not only can you make a copy of groups and objects like that, you can also tap the control key and make a copy of a face, or also of an edge. So it's very versatile. You could do multiple edges if you wanted to, so I could select these two by shift clicking and I could make a copy of those two. So it really allows you to make copies of basically whatever you want. And then the other nice thing about the move tool is not only can you make a single copy, you can make multiple copies. So if I click and drag across this object, I activate the move tool, I set my base point, and then I set my spacing. So let's say I want this to be 10 feet from that corner point. You can actually type in times and the number of copies that you want. So in this case, I'm going to type in ×5 and hit the enter key. Well, that creates 5 copies in this direction, each at the same spacing. So each one of these is 10 feet between these corner points. So you can create multiple copies by doing this. And not only can you create multiple copies, but you can also adjust the number of copies while the tool is still active. So all you have to do is just keep typing in distances, or keep typing in numbers of copies by typing in times and then the number of copies you want, and hit the enter key. And you can adjust this as many times as you want as long as the tool's still active. So as soon as I click somewhere else, then I can't type in ×5 or anything like that. So as long as the tool's active, you can create copies in a direction. So, and again, same kind of thing. You can do this with multiple objects selected as well. So I can type in ×5, ×10, ×20. You can create as many copies as you want by doing this. So this is a really powerful way to copy things in your object. And you can see how, again, I'm grouping all of these objects so that this stays organized. So I don't want 400 different groups in here showing up. I want to be able to minimize those. So I just selected all of these objects, and I just right-clicked, and I put them in a group. And so now I can take this object, and I can just kind of hide it. So, and I'm going to move it out of the way, but then I'm going to right-click, and I'm going to click Hide. So, and the other thing you can do, and I know I keep saying that, not only can you create copies of an object by multiplying, you can also do it by creating equally spaced copies between 2 points. So in this case, let's say, for example, that I make a copy of this object 50 feet out using the Move tool in copy mode. If I type in divided by 10, that's going to create 10 equally spaced copies between this point and this point. So in this case, you can also adjust it in the same way. So I can type in divided by 20. That'll create 20 copies. I can type in divided by 5, and it'll create 5 copies. So again, as long as that tool's active, you can create equally spaced copies between 2 points. So, and I know this video is getting a little bit long, but I kind of wanted to give you a woodworking example of this real quick. So in this case, what you could probably do is you could probably come in here and you could create a bookcase using these tools really quickly and really easily. So let's say I draw an object that's, we'll say it's 3 foot 6 inches deep by, we'll call it 3/4 of an inch. So what you can do is you can take that object, you can draw it using the rectangle tool, and then you could push pull it up. So let's say you wanted it to be 3 foot 6 inches high. So that would be my side panel of my bookcase. So I would come in here, I would make that a component, and I would call that side panel. And I'd click the create key. So now I have this side panel. Well, I could use the move tool in copy mode to create another copy of this. So let's say I wanted this to be 2 foot 6 inches wide. I'd just create a copy 2 foot 6 inches over. And remember, since these are components, if I change one, I can change the other one as well. And I'm looking at this and I'm feeling like it's way too deep. So all I'm going to do is double click in this object, push pull it back, and we'll go ahead and push pull it back 1 foot 6 inches. And you can see how both of these panels adjusted. Well, now what I can do is I can come in here and I can create kind of a base piece by drawing a rectangle and then extruding it to 3/4 of an inch. I'm just going to right click on it and make that a component, and we're just going to call that shelf. And so now with the shelf, I can use the move tool in copy mode. So activate the move tool by tapping the M key, click on this corner, and then tap the control key, and we're going to move that up along the blue axis to this point. And remember, since we use the move tool in copy mode, we can type in divided by 4 and create 4 equally spaced copies in here. So you can create a real quick, simple bookcase just by doing that. So, and again, if we decide that we want to come in here and we want to make this a little narrower, then all we'd have to do is just move this a little bit and then adjust this, and you can see how easy it is to make those changes because those are all in there as components. So this is something that's really quick and easy to model. And the other thing you could do real quick if you wanted to is you could just move this object up. So if you figured there was going to be some kind of gap down here, you could just use the move tool to move this up about 2 inches. And then if you needed to draw kind of a skirt piece, you could just use the rectangle tool to do that, and you could push pull that back 3/4 of an inch. So now you've got this simple bookcase model. Well, all you'd have to do here, and we'd want to keep everything organized, so I'm just going to select this object I drew here and make that a group. And we're just going to name that, we'll call it skirt trim. And then all you have to do is select these objects in your outliner, right click and click make group, and you could just rename this bookshelf. So now you've got your bookshelf in here as a group that's organized with all your different components that you can change really quickly, and you can move the parts and pieces in and out if you need to. So you can adjust everything individually by modeling things this way. Leave a comment below and let me know what you thought. Did I go too fast on any of this stuff? Do you find any of it useful? I just love having that SketchUp conversation with you guys. If you like this video, please remember to click that like button down below. If you're new around here, remember to click that subscribe button for new SketchUp content every week. If you like what I'm doing on this channel, please consider visiting my Support Me page on my website. That's TheSketchUpEssentials.com/support. That's just got some links where if you're interested in supporting the show, you can do that. But in any case, thank you so much for taking the time to watch this. I really appreciate it, and I will catch you in the next video. Thanks, guys.